Hello, good evening and welcome back to the Atma Paradigm. And today we are looking at species of life. This continues part 3 of our series on life, and it's species of life, a different story. What we're really looking at here is how the evidence, particularly the evidence that is offered in terms of the analysis of evolutionary theory, how that evidence reveals a completely different narrative of how life appears on Earth. So let's look at where we were last week. 2 weeks ago, we had a look at abiogenesis, the idea of the self-assembly of the first living thing. And we reached the conclusion that there's no clear concept of what that first living thing was, other than it needed several interdependent factors to be produced simultaneously before it could come together. And therefore we concluded that there was no standard theory or pathway by which self-assembly took place. There is no clear theory about how it works. And part of the difficulty that is there is that high information processes cannot be produced from low information, a high information system rather can't be produced from low information processes. And therefore our question is, well, what is the source of this information? And is there a role perhaps for a source of information that we do know of, i.e. consciousness? We're going to be exploring that in later talks. Now, that seems a reasonable postulation, the idea that consciousness might be involved in life, because it tends to be the symptom that we regard as most kind of valuable to our understanding of our own lives and the other lives possibly of other creatures. So, and also that consciousness is that phenomenon that is accommodated within a biological body. So last week we then looked at the kind of evolutionary processes of how come there's so many different varieties of life forms. Where do they all come from? And we considered the standard process of speciation offered by the neo-Darwinian evolution theory, and which is called the modern synthesis. And this is the one that's found in all the textbooks and all the online literature that is given to substantiate evolutionary narrative. Now, we propose that the processes at work that are given for evolution and leading to speciation, that those processes have limited scope. They can barely vary individual forms. They can barely produce some characteristics within a species, but they have very, very limited, possibly negligible ability to modify the individuals within a species so that they could be considered an actual permanent new species with novel features that don't regress possibly back to their original forms. So what we showed is that there is scant justification for this idea that the evolutionary process, as given by the neo-Darwinists, can produce speciation or macroevolution. And we give you a little chart. So instead of this being the story that natural selection acting on the variations that exist within a population is able to lead to speciation and macroevolution, i.e. the production of a brand new species, one species turning into another, or the divergence of one ancestor species into two distinct lineages of species. So instead of this idea, we suggested really the evidence and the processes seem to only suggest this, that there's some form of hereditary processes which produce that means within a particular species, intraspecies variants. So they're part of the same species, but they may appear different in various ways. But it is impractical to really count them as separate species if we're talking about it in terms of macroevolution. Now, this is important because today we're going to consider the other evidence that might justify the claims for speciation by macroevolution. And why are we doing this? Well, For the Atma paradigm, I think it's important that we open our minds that the standard evolutionary narrative, which really arises from the 19th century, is not as explanatory or as solid as we've been told. And we do that by considering the processes, as we did last week, and this week we look at the main evidence used to justify this as a narrative. And when we look at this evidence as it is, and we apply the perspective of consciousness-based life, we'll start to see a radically different perspective and way of explaining the huge variety of life forms that we see in this world. So, the evolutionary narrative can be summed up in a few statements, all right? And this is how it's commonly understood, okay? There's self-assembly of the first living thing. And then from that living thing, there is modification by descent through the generations of its descendants. And then simple things become complex. And mutations produce variation. And natural selection then acts on those different varieties and favors those variations of traits which are the most suited for helping individuals reach reproductive age and produce more offspring. And this is all helped because under certain circumstances, time and geography, there is something which helps to separate colonies. One colony is divided into two groups, and perhaps they can go down different evolutionary lines, and in that way become so diverse and so distinct that they no longer considered a single species. And that's really how species come. And the idea is that from one single life form, or maybe it happened several times, all the life forms that we know currently exists. Now, that's the story. But over the years, many biologists have realized that certain issues with this simple story, that there are problems. And they've revised our thinking about what's happening. Now, most of these biologists, and the ones I'm going to be talking about today, remain faithful, at least publicly, to the principle of evolution. But they believe that the evidence requires us to rethink how it happened. And that's important because within this analysis that they give, we can actually start to see many interesting, valuable points that are useful to us in order to develop a different picture, a more accurate picture of what may be happening. So I'm going to focus on the important movements within evolutionary theory over the past nearly 200 years. So the idea of an evolutionary process at work featured amongst many thinkers prior to the 19th century. And it actually became known as transformism. And one of the first persons who had a pretty good theory of how variations of species came about was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And his idea was the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And it's kind of explained in this picture of these giraffes. The idea that you've got a small giraffe, but it has either somehow or other, it stretches in order to get those high juicy leaves, when the other leaves are being eaten. So it's stretching. And during its lifetimes, it is acquiring physical characteristics. And that these are characteristics which are then passed on to the next generation. Now, there was a lot of queries at the time, but probably the most damning experiment on this was performed quite a few years later by August Weismann. And he did, must have been listening to 3 blind mice, and he decided to get a bunch of white mice, and he got 68 of them, and over 5 generations, he was chopping off their tails. So he got his mice, chopped off their tails, got them to reproduce, and lo and behold, the kids still had long tails. So they chopped those off, and then their kids still had long tails. They chopped those off, and so on. So that seemed to suggest that characteristics acquired physically within a lifetime could not be passed on. Now, actually, that kind of missed Lamarck's point. What Lamarck was actually indicating, and it may, whether consciously or unconsciously, he was indicating that the characteristics that are acquired by an individual through its own effort or will may be passed on. And that didn't apply to the mice. They didn't want to lose their tails, probably. So they weren't a situation of change or development that is a factor of the creature's interests, own interests. And actually, it is that point. This thing seemed to be dead in the water, but Lamarckian ideas are now making a comeback. So we're not going to lose that one entirely. We think even Jean-Baptiste had something to offer. And then, of course, next came Charles Darwin. He wasn't the first to come up with the idea of evolution. We already had this transformism. He didn't even come up with the word. He didn't use it in Origin of Species. He didn't. He used it in a later publication. He probably wasn't the only one to think of natural selection. And he and Alfred Wallace both got the idea of natural selection probably from a book on economics by Malthus, where it was looking at what are the pressures on a population and how the variations within a population might be affected by circumstances. So Darwin was smart to bring that economic principle of kind of selection into the idea of nature, that maybe nature could work together and choose those traits within individuals and within the group that were most favorable to reproductive success. And this came to be known as Darwin's idea of evolution. So, and it's shown in this little picture here. We've got our giraffes again. We've got two types of giraffe. One is a kind of small one with a small neck, and the other one has got a longer neck. Now, who is going to be able to eat more of these palm tree leaves? Well, that's going to be the high-necked one, whereas the short-necked giraffe dies and doesn't reproduce. So the species tends to move towards the long-necked one. That's okay. It doesn't take into account how other herbivores enjoy the food on the ground and find other things to eat, nor does it take into account the interdependent organs of the giraffe, which I'm going to talk to you later about. Now, after Darwin came one of his friends, it's the youngest of his friends from his student days, called George Romanes. And he was the one who coined neo-Darwinism. He actually coined this phrase in the late 19th century. And his thing was, his mate Darwin hadn't really shown how natural selection on its own could establish speciation. So he was calling for something more. We need Darwin's idea, but we need something more, i.e. neo-Darwinism. And he thought that may be something to do with separating the variants of a group from their parents. So he was kind of hinting at the sort of allopatric speciation that comes when geography might play a role, like we saw last week, when a river separates one group into two and they can diverge. But he still felt something more was needed. And that came something, we needed something that produced greater variety within the traits of a group. Because if it was just, the standard stuff that came from parents to their kids, that didn't seem to be enough to really generate speciation. It might help the drift of a particular species in a direction, but not that it was going to cause speciation. You needed something more substantial, and that was the point we were making last week. But the idea of something that could produce heritable traits that would vary the characteristics of a group came from a Dutch botanist called Hugo de Vries. And he recognized that offspring seemed to get one gene from one parent and one gene from another, and somehow or other the dominant gene or dominant thing produced an effect, a trait within them. And he also saw that sometimes there might be some mutation which from the father or the mother, or how it happened. At that time, it wasn't very clear. The understanding genetics was still in its infancy. But it shows here we've got a normal ewe, which is the female, and the normal ram, the male. But it might have a mutant ewe with short legs. Now, short legs might be a very attractive feature for some farmers, particularly here in Wales, where they always kind of joke that the Welsh sheep can get out of any field and run around. So maybe it'd be easier to farm ones with short legs. But other than that, it's hard to see how that's a particularly beneficial trait in nature. So, but the idea came that mutations are something useful. They can be incorporated, they can create variants, and natural selection now has something significant to work on. Now, the term neo-Darwinism has stuck, but ironically, it was coined before the idea of mutations came about. So we also use the term modern synthesis, which was coined by Huxley in the 40s, to describe this particular theory of evolution. And it's the standard one that is still taught. I'm going to go on to show how later biologists in the latter part of the 20th century and the 21st century have very different ideas. But this idea still sticks, and it is still being taught, even though there are many, many challenges to it. So my question, last week we looked at the process of the modern synthesis and found that it really couldn't get us to speciation. So what is the other evidence that substantiates the committed belief that neo-Darwin, modern synthesis, evolution actually causes the speciation and the production of all the different life forms that we see around us? What is that evidence? Well, the first thing to note is that there is no direct evidence, and that's understood. Biologists warn us that we're not expected to see macroevolution taking place. Sometimes some of them are bold and say, yes, we can see evolution happening in front of our eyes, but those examples tend to be microevolution. They're indicating variations within a species. For instance, bacteria might seem to be mutating into a different strain or something like that. These are very small things. We see them in humans, we see them in animals. Microevolution, we know, seems to occur. So examples which show microevolution, fine. But where there is no direct evidence that we can expect to see of one species turning into another, because it doesn't happen that often, apparently. When you actually look at how often it needs to happen, you could be sitting around for 1 million years or more waiting for it to happen, and you may not be in the right place at the right time. So other examples of speciation that are given. Questions the borders that we put on what is a species. Are they simply variants, or are they really independent species? They may seem not to interbreed with one another at this moment. Is that a permanent situation if the need arose? So, and we saw that in the example of the Galapagos finches, where these are very clearly counted as lots of different species, example of speciation in action. But really what we now see is that there is regression, because the differences, the physiological differences that are seen to be manifest are plastic. And this is a term that's been used more and more in recent years, that many of these changes are plastic, meaning that they can manifest, but they're temporary and could regress quite happily. So besides direct evidence, we need to consider inferred evidence. And this comes in different forms. The first I'm going to look at is homology. And probably homology is the most important, and I will show how it really underpins all the other types of evidence that are offered. Now, homology basically means the study of similar features. And there are 3 types of similarities that are used by biologists looking at the different species. One, simple common structures and organs, the physical appearance and the structure of the body and the organs that are in it. The second is the use of DNA. And the third, we will also look at ontogeny, which is to do with the development of the embryo. Now, when we study, we'll look at the first one, structures and organs. When we study the anatomy of many different creatures, they seem to be very different in their form and the abilities. But then when we kind of look under the skin, if you like, we start to see there's some similarity in their physical features. I've shown one example, which is a kind of common one. We have on the left the human, which is our left arm, and then we have a leg of a horse, the fin of a whale, and the wing of a bat. And they look very different from the outside, and even from the bone structure, they appear to be different. All the bones are different sizes, shapes, etc. But the interesting thing is that they seem to have similar numbers and they seem to be in the similar areas. And this diagram very helpfully colors, for instance, the humerus, this top part of the arm in blue, and the corresponding bone in the horse, whale and the bat, and similar with the radius and ulna, you know, etc. And so there's a kind of similarity between all these different features, and that's great. This is a really interesting point. Now we know more about genetics, we can understand how that is the case. And because we know about genetics, we still have to ask the question, well, wait a minute, it's not that these bones themselves are plastic. We can say that the form of a creature exhibits a certain plasticity, but these are not made of plasticine. They require to be specified, and surely that's connected with the genetic information within the cells of these different creatures. The cells within a human are saying that our humerus will be this shape. The one of a horse is saying it'll be that shape, the whale has that, and the bat has it. So you can't just mold them like plasticine. You need to understand the genetic changes that are required to specify each of them. So, and all these changes have to be holistic. There's no point giving a human a bat wing. The form has to suit the whole body. So it's not just a question of changing one part. It has to be holistic. It has to, each part has to suit the whole. And there are many interdependent aspects. We'll look at a couple later today, and there will also be some popping up in other talks. But we need to consider the interdependence of each feature, and how if you change one, you may have to change many other aspects of the same species. So the other question that could be asked is, all right, so there's homology, so that there's this sort of commonality in the different forms. Is that the only, or is evolution the only explanation of this phenomenon? Or would we be better with another theory that also explained the commonality, but also explained how these different versions come to be manifest? Because that's the challenge, really. It's not just a question of saying, well, these are common, therefore the evolution. No, or this is common, therefore there's some other idea. We also still have to show how the differences come about. There is commonality, but there's certainly difference. And perhaps we're looking at here at something we talked about in part 2, when we looked at matter and reality, beta, that there is distinction and there's commonality. DNA is another thing that is common to all life on Earth that we know of. And again, very important and interesting observation. And life forms are linked in this way. They all use the DNA molecule. They don't necessarily have the same biochemical pathways, and there are some very interesting examples on that one. But again, is the theory of evolution the only one that fulfills this idea of commonality of DNA? Or is there no other theory that anyone could come up with that could account for it, as we will try to do later? And would it not be good to have a theory that not only explains the commonality, but that can account for the original specifying information that is required within DNA in order to account for the physical features that that creature has? So that becomes a challenge. Sometimes you will see in the literature aspects of embryology and the work of Ernst Haeckel, who proposed a kind of biogenic law, and he summed it up as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is basically that the development of the embryo kind of shows the evolutionary ancestors that it came to. So the growth and development of an organism somehow reveals its evolutionary history. Now, this idea has been kind of pretty well trashed through the 20th century. It was later rejected by Gould and punctuated like when he dealt with it. The EVO-DEVO biologists, which we're also going to mention, also have trashed it. So it's pretty well a non-entity. There may be some interesting aspects of embryology that we can learn from this, but on its own, this is not considered to be a strong element of homologous thinking. Then there's vestiges or vestigial things. A vestige is some kind of feature of a species that, this is how it's defined. It's a feature of a species that was an adaptation from its ancestors. It was something that existed in the ancestors, but now it's either lost its usefulness completely or has been changed and appears to be used, or co-opted is the word, for new uses. Now, there's different types. There's vestigial structures and organs, and there's also, we should look at vestigial DNA. Now, there used to be 200 or so examples of vestigial organs claimed for the human body. The most famous, of course, is the appendix. And none of these are without their use. You can live without it, as I've done since I was 10. I had lost my appendix very carelessly. But the appendix does play an important function, cultivating and sending out friendly bacteria into the digestive tract. So it's not inactive or useless for humans. And that's particularly important for those who might live in an area where they would be suffering regular bouts of dysentery. So it helps to produce friendly bacteria into the gut. Similarly, the human coccyx is another example, the tailbone. This is considered to be a vestigial thing. We don't have a tail normally. It sometimes appears through mutations as an atavism, but we don't have, but still the coccyx, as it is normally, is useful. It holds ligaments for use in your back muscle, so you wouldn't want to be without it or damage it. So the other way that a feature is considered vestigial is if it has been co-opted or used differently. And often the wings of flightless birds are considered to be vestigial because somehow or other they used to be birds and then now they've become flightless for some reason. They still got wings, but the wings won't help them fly. So why would you want to have wings if you can't fly? So because this no longer fulfills the original function, it is considered to be vestigial. But that's not fair, either on the ostrich, as we have here, or its wings. Because the ostrich is a running bird and it uses its wings for its balance. So it is very happy with its wings. It uses them very effectively, but not in the way that that another creature uses. So what is the point of a vestigial organ? How is it significant if we use a particular organ in a different way than maybe another creature does? That doesn't make it vestigial. That just means we're using it in the way that it suits us. Why would we want to use it in the way that suits another creature with its own interests? So the vestigial idea is actually, it's a circular argument, that you're saying that something is vestigial from a previous ancestor because you don't use it in the way that the ancestor used. But maybe I never did and never wanted to. Maybe that's not the reason why I have the type of feature I have, and that other creature has the type of feature it has. They may seem to be linked homologously, but that doesn't mean one is descended from the other. And we'll show examples where there is very clear breach of that. Then another famous example is the pelvic bone of the whale, because there it is, it's ringed in red, and it's right inside the whale, and actually doesn't seem to be of any use whatsoever. So it seems an obvious shrunken version of a leg that would have been part of maybe a previous ancestor. So a shrunken version of its former glory in a predecessor species. But for the whale, it's not useless. It's actually vital for the male to maintain contact with the female during mating. So kind of useful. So these and other examples demonstrate that all creatures share what seems to be a sort of common template, but that the forms of each component within an animal, within each, they vary tremendously. Now, I think in the 19th century, it's fine to think of them as plastic and easy to change from one shape to another. Or later, when they had a kind of simplistic idea of what mutations were and what they could do. So I don't think it's suitable now. In 21st century, these are not good examples and not really supported. We're not denying homology. We're saying that there is commonality, but macroevolution is not the only way to look at this evidence. And it's probably not even the best way, particularly as gradualism, which is the linchpin of the neo-Darwinian modern synthesis, has been under attack. All these ideas of vestigial stuff work fine, or appear to work fine, if there is some gradual change which is slowly manipulating the genes, slowly manipulating the physical features in order to produce something else. But here is Stephen Jay Gould. And I've read places where he's been called the greatest paleontologist of the 20th century. He was at Columbia University, and he and his colleagues concluded that when they actually studied the fossil record, when they studied all the evidence that we have in biology and paleontology, we don't find gradual change in species, as was predicted by Darwin and his successors. Now, Stephen Jay Gould is a committed, or was a committed evolutionist, but he did spend his life questioning the 19th century, early 20th century assumptions. So here's just some of the examples of how he came to this conclusion, that we do not see gradual change. First, there seems to be long periods in the fossil record of almost complete stability, unchanged stasis. And eventually this might seem to be interrupted by outbreaks of new species that appear suddenly. For instance, here's a fossil of a dragonfly from the early Carboniferous period. So you're going back quite a long time. And here is a dragonfly today, pretty well indistinguishable from the original after 350 million years. Or another famous one, the coelacanth. It was, it's often kind of portrayed, it belongs to the oldest group of lobe-finned lungfish. And these are said to be the ancestors, or very early branch of the lobe-finned fish, who then later climbed onto the land. They were assumed to be extinct and replaced by more modern looking fish. And remember that we often look at these things in the past and they're very different and antique looking, whereas modern creatures were more familiar and seem to look different. Okay, that's our kind of modern era bias. But these coelacanths are now regularly turning up in the Indian Ocean, unchanged for 400 million years. And what I've ringed in the two pictures is a little kind of feature at the back of the fin, showing that this coelacanth, although there's many different types of coelacanths, there are varieties within the species. This one has exactly the same kind of tail feature that is its forefathers, if you like, had way back 400 million years before, unchanged. And Stephen Jay Gould also noted that when we look at the fossil record, again, we see whether it's preserved in stone or whether a creature is preserved in amber, that we see that this creature has all its limbs fully formed, fully functional. They may look different to creatures we know today, but that may not be the case in the mosquito. I think that's very similar to the modern one. However, but it is a fully functioning whole organism. We don't find partly formed limbs or any limbs or organs in transition, because organs need to be holistic. And this is part of the analysis, that all creatures have the organs that are suited to their whole body. They are interdependent. And we mentioned giraffes earlier. And giraffes have one of the most powerful hearts. They're nearly 2 foot long, 60 centimeters. They weigh 24 pounds. And this is what is needed in order to pump the blood all the way up its long neck to the brain. The giraffe's blood pressure is twice that of other mammals. So you might think, well, okay, maybe the heart and its ever-lengthening neck develop together. But that in itself would be a problem for the giraffe, particularly when it bends down to drink water, because when it lowers its head to the ground, then all this highly pressurized blood would come crashing down onto its brain. So that would kill it straight off. However, in the upper part of the giraffe's neck, there's a complex kind of pressure regulation system that maintains constant blood flow, whatever the height and of its neck. And there are elastic blood vessels that connect to one-way valves. So there's a very complicated system that is entirely inherent within the giraffe in order to maintain the blood pressure that it needs, and to cater for that blood pressure, not just in the neck, but even in the legs. They could, with this high blood pressure, the giraffe should be bursting its blood vessels everywhere, but it's got extra thick skin and fascia just to hold on to the blood vessels and stop them bursting. So a giraffe can't live without all of those organs functioning at once. So this seems to indicate to Gould that gradualism just doesn't seem to work. But I think the final nail in the coffin for gradualism came in 2010 from work from here in the UK at the University of Reading. The group there did a study of 101 DNA-produced phylogenetic trees. These are the kind of trees of life that you see branching everywhere from around the world. So they took pretty well every type of species group was included within this. And they sifted through, and they had 101 really good trees that were that analyzed by DNA. Now, it's important that when these trees are defined by DNA, the way it's worked out is that you calculate how many mutations it would need in order to match this creature's DNA with this creature's DNA, how many mutations. And we kind of are able to put a figure to the time that would take. So from this analysis, they analyzed the length of time between all the so-called speciation events that these charts show. Okay? And if the theory of gradual accumulation of mutations was correct, the chart that would be formed when they looked at it should be like this, a kind of normal curve. That's the chart for gradual evolution. This is what they found. That none of the charts that they saw looked like that. None of them. Rather, the vast majority, 78%, looked like this. This is not the chart for gradual evolution. This is the chart for sudden, one-off, accidental, they call it, events. Something that is not an accumulation. It is the punctuated appearance of each species type. Now, this led, Gould didn't have the benefit of the work from Reading, but he called his theory punctuated equilibrium. And it was the idea that something must be happening inside that suddenly produces a sudden change, a punctuated change in the morphology or the form of that creature, a speciation event. So he, using the example of the horse, which is a kind of common one, instead of this steady progression from predecessor horses with which were small and grew and kind of developed different features over many generations, his view is that there is stasis for a long time and then suddenly bang. After a build-up of internal changes, suddenly there's a kind of explosion of a new form, as we've got ringed in red in the lower line. Now, this is at odds with the standard story of the appearance of the horse. After all, the story of the horse is meant to be like this, from Hyracotherium all the way up to modern Equus. And that's the normal kind of chart that's kind of shown. But here is a more honest version of this, showing the actual placement of these species as they are found in the fossil record and how they are dated over the past 5 million years. Now, if you notice that all the vertical red lines in the chart don't match up, they don't link up together. They show that they are individual horse-like critters running around, doing their own thing in different parts of the world, but there is no direct evidence that seems to link them in descent. So if you want to say that one developed into another, you're doing that on the basis of your belief that the evolutionary theory is how you must interpret this. The only joined up bit is up at the top there. And if we have a closer look at that, we'll see the reason that that's all joined up is because this is Equus. This is the modern horse, one species type. And it looked like it spread throughout the different continents somehow or other over the recent kind of time period. Now, my point here is that we're not challenging the scientific evidence gathered for the dating or the geographical distribution of various species types, right? We're not challenging all that. And we know that they may seem similar in form and activity. But what we suggest, as did Stephen Jay Gould, that this evidence that is offered for kind of the modern synthesis interpretation does not establish modification by gradual descent. And nor can it really establish Gould's idea. Because which of the lines is supposed to have suddenly turned into or diverged to form Equus? He still hasn't answered. That still is required in this. So there may be punctuated appearance, but is that punctuated appearance necessarily a change from the previous species? So although these charts and his evidence establish punctuated appearance, it doesn't necessarily prove that that appearance is on account of the processes that Gould himself suggests. And this, I suppose, represents part of the problem that besets many evolutionary charts. They are based on rather outdated assumptions of gradual development. Yet all of them fail to substantiate the path, either with clear pathways from one species to another, or with examples of fossils or intermediate species. They simply assume that there must be some common ancestor because we've got two creatures. They seem to be related in the way in their form in some way. So they must have had a common ancestor. For instance, here's the chart for primates. We've got lorises and lemurs on the left, and we've got humans on the right. And these are kind of lined up in the sort of order of closeness, if you like, that is said to be our relatives. We are not descended from any of these individuals that are currently existing, but they are cousins and second cousins and third, fourth, fifth, they are relatives down the line. So this is simply just lining up the homologous features and DNA data that makes it seem that, for instance, the closest to us are the chimpanzees, and then the next closest are the gorillas, and then the orangutans, and then gibbons, and so on. And that's really how it works. And then you make assumptions. Well, if you kind of go back from each of these, they must have linked up. And the ones that are closest probably linked up most recently. So we then kind of have all these intersections or branching points. And these are called the last common ancestors of these particular lineages that emerged. And at the bottom, we have some kind of ancient primate. It's almost like the Luca for the primates. But there still is no evidence that can help us identify specific common ancestors for any of these circles. These charts simply presuppose descent from common species. They're not evidence for it. The evidence, or the thing that makes the chart seem reasonable, is the homology, the common features that are shared amongst these distinct creatures. And a similar picture is there in the chart showing the species groups, the classes. Like here's one from, we've got sharks and bony fish and amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals. And in this case, instead of doing a kind of last common ancestor, the links between the classes are shown by the dotted lines at the base of each class. Now, the only rationale for those dotted lines is presumption, the presumption of descent. There is no direct evidence, only homologous inference that these seem to be the closest we can link one class of mammals to reptiles, birds to reptiles, and so on. So really, since this chart is meant to present the species that we know, it shouldn't have the inference and the speculation attached to it. It should look more like that. That is our understanding of how all these different classes of species appeared over all these ages. We're not arguing with the dating, we're not arguing with how they might have grouped the classes, but when you actually see how they've done it, it does seem to suggest punctuated appearance of major classes with their respective features fully formed. And this is true for the classes. It's also true for all the other charts showing orders, families, the genera, and the individual species. Now, we mentioned transitional species or missing links. Where do they figure? Surely there is many examples. And I've seen some presentations which try to show us, oh yeah, there's loads and loads and loads. Not that many, really. And here's a few of the famous ones. The Tiktaalik rosei is cited as a transitional species for tetrapods, four-legged land creatures. This creature has fish features. It's got gills, scales and fins. However, it can go out of the water, it seems, because the bones in their fins seem similar to mammals and might be suitable for bearing weight. Plus it had a mobile neck and strong rib cage, so it could push itself along the seabed, and therefore it is considered that maybe it could perhaps push itself onto land for a short while. No argument. Now, the earliest Tiktaalik fossil record, the fossil that we have found, is 385 million years ago. And that seemed to fit the idea of it being a transitional precursor to the first tetrapods, i.e. four-legged creatures on land. Now, that worked well until a recent discovery, which was covered by Nature magazine. And what this showed was that there were sets of four-legged tracks which could be accurately dated to 397 million years, predating the earliest known existence of Tiktaaliks by 18 million years. So the conclusion is that Tiktaalik is no longer the direct ancestor of four-legged things. Possibly it's another independent, now extinct branch. So that is shown in the area over here. Instead of being on this line to the tetrapods, it is on a line to the Pistostegalians. So many evolutionists now say, actually, we shouldn't really be thinking about or looking for missing links or transitional species or intermediates. These are kind of outdated terms, going back to the idea when the idea of one big chain of being. The picture is obviously much more complex than that. So you're not going to find these in the fossil records. So we don't look for that anymore. Really, since the 1960s, the work has been on what's called cladistics. Cladistics, it looks at the clads, the way that you can classify animals and plants in terms of the shared characteristics, which you might deduce to have originated in a common ancestor of a group of species from evolution. And so you're looking at what we just talked about, homology. All you're looking at is things which seem to be similar. We're no longer trying to identify which species managed to give another. All we're able to say is that these two species seem to have similar features, similar organs, similar bone structures, and so on. And one of the best examples given for how cladistics is used and what it might tell us is the supposed evolution of the whale from Pachycetus way down here, that's its shape. It's kind of almost dog-shaped, you would kind of say. That's its size in comparison to the grey little dot beside it is the size compared to the whale size at the top. This is called an evogram, right? An evolution gram. It's showing 5 different species and how the whale and each of these other species seem to have similar features and bone structures. And it's meant to trace the whale features back through time to the other creatures that lived before it. But really all we're looking at here is the homology of features, but with the features lined up with creatures to fit the evolutionary narrative. So unfortunately, we are looking at the evidence and trying to arrange homology and cladistics in order to suit the presumption that these similar features arise from descent. However, another group of evolutionists require us to kind of rethink homology. It's not as simple as you think. These are the EVO-DEVOs. They are the evolutionary developmental biologists. Now, this is a branch of biology, particularly in the 21st century, and it specifically tries to compare the developmental processes of different organisms to infer the ancestral relationships between them. In many ways, you can consider this deep homology. And in short, and this will be something we're going to explore, there's more to be said on this in future talks. For now, we just need to appreciate that the EVO-DEVO biology suggests that all the genetic information required for every species, either entirely or within a very big group or very big class, is already existing within the original ancestral genome. So, not that there's mutations and things added along the way to produce the new features, but that all the features of all the so-called descendant species are actually available in the ancestor in its DNA. Now, that sounds pretty tall order, but there's evidence. For instance, snakes. Snakes have genes that they require to give them legs. They just don't use them. So all the genes for all sorts of purposes are pre-existing in the DNA of many creatures, but they're used differently by those creatures. Let me see if I can explain this chart to you, because I think it's helpful. It shows a lot of different creatures, from fish, frogs, lizards, songbirds, other birds, down to mammals. And we're looking at how these different creatures have the ability to make sounds. Now, the genes that each of them need are contained as they're part of the shared DNA that each of these have, from fish to mammals. But the fish uses particular genes within that DNA information and to make its gas bladder, which fits in with the way it uses other genes to create its fish body. So that's how fish can talk to one another. The frog has the same genetic information, you know, has a batch of shared stuff. There's differences, but it's got a batch of shared stuff. And in part of the shared stuff is the genes that it uses to make a larynx, something in the throat that it can croak with. And birds and mammals also have genes within the shared pool, what is called the toolkit. So within these species, there is a DNA toolkit. Part of their DNA information contains this toolkit to produce any of these types of voice apparatus. But they make the voice apparatus that is suitable for those particular creatures. So birds and mammals have the ones that give them a type of larynx. Plus the songbirds use genes that others don't use and get more than just a larynx. They get a syrinx and also a song circuit. And that makes them be able to tweet lots and lots. Nicer and more often than even the US president. So here are the EVO-DEVO ramifications. That the same DNA toolkit is available in all members of a group of creatures, and that could be a very, very big group or class. The toolkit holds potential for all the features of that group. There's no need for mutations in this picture. If the toolkit is common, then other homology follows. So in one sense, what the EVO-DEVOs are saying, of course there's similarity, because actually they're all using, they've all got the same genes. You know, there's a toolkit that is present in all these different species. Now, if you think that this toolkit is a demonstration of gradual, evolution, or evolution over by descent, then you've kind of got to go back and say, wait a minute, I thought the earliest creatures were meant to be simple with very little DNA, and we just keep adding it over the years. And now you're saying that all the DNA requires to be there in the ancestor. How do we get to that? That's kind of like saying that we've got a blueprint. You know, here's a Ford car. Ford have got a blueprint, and in order to build this standard saloon car. But instead of just that blueprint specifying that one car, that same blueprint has bits of it that specify the exact information that can be used for every other possible vehicle that Ford would make, whatever its type and use and activity. So this raises the requirement for the information complexity of the DNA at the ancestral level. And this ups the stake for high information being needed at the earliest stage of living things on Earth. And it raises the question, why would ancestor creatures hold genetic information for features that have no requirement of that species? So perhaps what we're seeing is some very deep commonality at the genetic level used to specify and manifest all species. And that what it indicates is something taken up by another group of biologists. These group, one of Gould's statements was that if the videotape of evolution was replayed again and again, it would play differently every time it ran. Why? Because it's meant to just be random. But this group of biologists disagree. They believe that the evidence indicates what they call the arrow of evolution. And here's some of their thinking. nature seems to strive for complexity against the effect of entropy. But let's not, when we talk about complexity, let's be clear. We're not necessarily talking about genetic complexity, because even a comb jelly, which is meant to have diverged from us before everything else, way back in the midst of time, has 19,000 genes, the same number as human beings. So genetic complexity isn't the issue, but complexity of form and abilities, the functions of our form and our abilities. That's what seems to be happening. So the surprise is that the more complex functions of, say, in this picture, dinosaurs, mammals, and humans, make them less robust to survive the harsh vagaries of life on Earth. What easily survives on Earth are bacteria. They've had a great time, billions of years. They're doing grand. All the others come and go. So it's shocking that these complex functions should be the things that nature seems to want to produce. So either humans and the higher mammals are just blips in evolution, or what the picture seems to be is that nature is working hard against the odds to produce these complicated life forms. And this idea is supported by the studies that these guys do, particularly on what's called energy rate density. This is a quantitative way of measuring the amount of information that is present within a system. So the biologists have tried to calculate the amount of information on planet Earth, over the period from when life appeared throughout the whole history. And this is what the chart looks like. So only when the Earth started to produce ecosystems with plants, animals, and the animals with brains, which is probably most of them, and then humans, then that's when we see the exponential rise of information and complexity. So they believe that we cannot understand how life appears and develops without addressing this relentless arrow of increasing complexity and extra information. They manage to link information and life together. Life seems to oblige nature to produce information-hungry forms. This is a very different way of starting to look at what's happening in nature. And a good example of this is what's called convergent evolution. The idea that there is independent evolution or appearance of similar features in species of different lineages. I remember Stephen Fry talking about this and saying, oh yes, this is just convergent evolution. As if that itself was an explanation. Just because you've got a name for it, you've got an explanation. Well, it's not. This is another conundrum of the evolutionary narrative. Because what we have here is the wings of a bird, the wing of a reptile, and the wing of a mammal. Now, in each of those, these are separate lineages. One did not come from the other, but separately, birds seem to develop wings, reptiles seem to have developed wings, mammals seem to have developed wings. So, convergent in that nature seems to want to provide winged opportunity for different classes of creatures. And that's extraordinary. It's a conundrum for evolution. And it doesn't just have, it's not just wings. The eye is another example. The eye's probably appeared at least 6 different times. Even with the evolution narrative, these are 6 independent situations, 6 independent lineages. So something seems to be at work, pushing nature to produce organs and senses that can perceive using sound, light, touch, etc., or organs and senses that might facilitate a creature in crucial activities such as movement, communication, manipulation. So, are we seeing a link through all of this between the increased information and increased conscious awareness, and also a link between the production of forms for perception and activity, which really are the sort of features that are linked to experience and enjoyment of consciousness. This is something we'll be developing in the next few talks. So let me just kind of come to a summary and see what we have gained from today's analysis. I hope that we found something of value in each of the ideas, from LAMARCK through Darwin, all the way up to the EVO-DEVOs and arrow of evolution folk. And there are more interesting factors that we'll be bringing into the future talks. But let's see what we've got from each of these we've looked at. First of all, we have LAMARCK, that the idea that certain physical traits may be possible to pass on. We'll see how certain physical traits can start off as physical, but then can become fixed as genetically heritable traits. That was something that LAMARCK and people didn't realize until the present day. We looked at Darwinian ideas that favorable traits may be selected and passed on. Last week, we accepted that natural selection is a normal, happy process at work within populations, whether it's humans or critters. The modern synthesis tells us that favorable genetic changes may be passed on. Okay, favorable, that we're not arguing with that. We just said that that alone cannot help us with speciation because it's limited. It'll just produce slight modification and changes within a population. Punctuated equilibrium of Stephen Jay Gould gave us the understanding that gradualism is not shown in the evidence of the fossils and in botany and in biology. Rather, what we seem to have a situation is the punctuated appearance of creatures fully formed in the fossil record, and that's worth taking in, further. The EVO-DEVOs show us that there is a DNA toolkit which seems common to species groups, and this is something that is vital to explore. And in all of this, there is a link between information, forms, and consciousness awareness, which seems to be revealed in the analysis of the arrow of evolution biologists. So we're taking something a little bit from each of these. You know, in this analysis, I've relied on the evidence and the propositions as presented by these biologists over the last 200 years. I'm not arguing against their science. I'm not challenging the dating. And frankly, the various parties have argued amongst themselves, and you know, they can't seem to agreement. I perhaps am more generous because I'd like to draw something from each of these folk. You know, look at the evidence that they have uncovered, look at maybe the insights that they've come up with, but rather than try to prejudge that under an evolutionary idea, I want to look at all of this evidence and insights and suggest that they are crying out for a fresh interpretation. Let's get beyond the 19th century concepts of life. We're in the 21st century. We know more about biology, genetics, physics. We can come up with something much better. So, having clarified where the Atma Paradigm stands on evolutionary theory and what we can draw from these historical theories and evidence, I think we are now ready to move into a 21st century concept of life on Earth. And that's where we'll be going in the next 4 talks within part 3 of the Atma Paradigm. And thank you very much for joining us. Next week, we'll be looking at life is driven by consciousness and how all life expresses the interest of consciousness. Because different folk are connecting to us through Facebook and YouTube, and it's not possible to do the questions online as we might have been doing way back, I'd like to suggest that please submit emails to us through either of those, through the Facebook page, or I hope it can be done through YouTube as well. But thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week, 17th, Thursday, same time, 6 o'clock UK time. Thank you. Hare Krishna.